Hello again. I am a fan of replication, and I love replication so much that this will be a replication of John's morning keynote, where I'm essentially going to make all of the same points just with different slides. But hopefully you will find this useful both for reinforcing some of the messages that he delivered, and I will put it in the context of me as a psychologist and how it is we at the Center for Open Science have conceived of this challenge of reproducibility as a behavioral challenge, and particularly in terms of solutions, how the context of the cultures, policies, incentives, and norms all shape the behavior that we do as researchers. My lab's research interest at the University of Virginia is on the gap between values and practices, what we think we should do, what we want to do, what we're trying to do, versus what we actually do in our everyday behavior. And the Center for Open Science is a spin-out from the lab that is a practical application of that research interest. What are our scientific values, and what are our scientific behaviors? And to the extent that there is a gap between those, would addressing that gap improve scientific progress, accelerate how it is we get to discovery, accelerate how it is we understand the phenomena that we're dealing with, and improving reproducibility overall. So what I want to do is just give you a general tour of the issues that have already come up today in this context of how do we think about shifting those cultural norms, incentives, and policies toward greater reproducibility. So the idea of norms and counter-norms already came up. Marcia made a comment about it during the last session. And this is a good place to start in thinking about what are our scientific values and what are actually things that happen in practice. So Robert Merton in the 1940s and 50s articulated what he conceived of as the norms of science. They include things like communality, the open sharing of information. When I make a research claim, you don't just believe it because I say so. You will come to believe in its credibility based on being able to evaluate the basis of evidence. What's the methodology that was performed? What data was produced? How was inference drawn from that in order to arrive at the claim? Versus the counter-norm of secrecy. Nope, just trust me, just trust me. Right? Another norm of universalism, right? Research is evaluated based on its own merit, the quality of the methodology and inference process, rather than on particularism. Famous person X said it, we have to believe it. Right? Disinterestedness. Researchers are motivated by knowledge and discovery versus self-interestedness. All I'm trying to do is get ahead of the people down the hall so that I can advance my career. Organized skepticism. A researcher considers all new evidence, even against their prior work, in order to get to true understanding, versus organized dogmatism. I write my dissertation and then I spend the rest of my career defending it against all of the attackers who are trying to undermine my claims, my contribution to science. Right? And then another one that Merton didn't talk about but has already come up today is this notion of quality as a norm versus quantity as a normative aspect of science. So these may be recognizable as norms, but the question is, what do scientists themselves endorse? How do they think science should operate between these norms and counter-norms? Anderson and her colleagues investigated that by doing a survey of NIH awardees. In this case, early career are people who are in their postdoctoral positions, and mid-career researchers were those that were in their first R01 award, so average age of around 40 in this sample. And what they did was they surveyed, saying, which of these do you endorse, the norm or the counter-norm? And what you're seeing here is the cumulative plot. 100% of the respondents. In gray is the 90% who said, I endorse the norms over the counter-norms of how science should operate. In black are the 2% or so that said, no, I endorse the counter-norms. That's how science should operate over the norms. And the hatches are those that said these should have equal weight in how science should be done. So then Anderson and her colleagues said, okay, that's fine. Don't tell me what you endorse. Tell me how you behave. What do you do in your work every day? And it looks like this. Right? So still 60% or more are saying that they behave according to the norms of science, but a substantial portion are acknowledging that those counter-norms also influence their behavior. They're not necessarily doing things for the good of science. They're also influenced by what's good for them, what can advance their own career. And then still very, very few are saying that they actually behave according to the counter norms over the norms. So then they said, okay, that's fine. Don't tell me what you do. Tell me what the other people do in your area of research. What's their behavior like? Looks like this. So researchers endorse the norms of science. They say these are how science should operate. They claim individually they largely try to live up by those, but they don't perceive that those norms are what drives the culture of science around them. That others are doing things that are better for self-enhancement than they are for scientists' advancement. And that gap between what I want to be true and what I perceive to be what's rewarded in science is the key gap that we want to try to address. And there are lots of discussions that have already been raised about how it is that this gap may emerge. For us, the key challenge is that the incentives for my success as a practicing researcher are focused on me getting it published, not on me getting it right. The more that I publish and the more prestigious those publications, the more I will be rewarded regardless of its accuracy. Now, accuracy, of course, is something that I want, but it is not necessarily directly incentivized. And because publication is the currency of advancement, there are some things that are more publishable than other things. I'm more likely to get published if I get a positive result than a negative result. I'm more likely to get published if I have a novel finding rather than something that repeats something that someone else has done. And I'm more likely to get published with a neat and tidy story where all of the research lines up and reinforces a very clear conceptual conclusion, as opposed to one that shows lots of exceptions and loose ends and things that don't quite make sense in the theoretical narrative understanding the finding. So a novel, positive, tidy story is the best outcome, right? It is the best outcome in reality, and it's the best outcome for career advancement. It's the best outcome for reality because that is true innovation. You found something new, and you've provided an amazing and compelling explanation for why it is that that occurs. The challenge, of course, is that that very rarely actually happens in the lab, right? The things that we are studying are hard problems, and so our progress on those problems is full of false starts, is full of things that don't quite make sense and don't fit together, is full of trying to build a little bit on what others have done to see if you can push the boundaries of knowledge out. So we are incentivized to get a positive, novel, tidy story together, but a lot of our work is not that. And so what results is that we have a conflict of interest. What's good for us versus what's good for science. It's good for me with lots of flexibility in what studies I report in my papers and what analyses within those studies I report in those papers to present to you, the reader, the best possible view of the work that I've done. Right? At the same time, leaving out all of that information may undermine the credibility of the claims that I've come to. And the real challenge is that I may not even recognize that I'm doing it, right? Because I'm not in science to get papers, but I'm incentivized for that. I'm in science to try to figure things out, but I have these amazing tools in my frontal lobes of rationalization, where I see a finding that doesn't quite fit my narrative, and I find reasons to doubt the methodology, find reasons to put it aside. I do multiple analyses, and some of them look better for me in terms of publishability than others. And so I suddenly find reasons that those are the right analyses to do. Those are what fits my theoretical story. And so I'm more likely to privilege those things. That motivated reasoning may ultimately help me arrive at conclusions that best fit the outcomes that are good for me. And the challenge, of course, is that there's lots and lots of opportunity for those kinds of biases to have influence at different stages of the research life cycle. And many of these terms have already come up in the variety of talks this morning, of ways in which we may overfit our findings, may look at multiple things, may selectively report what it is we've learned that ultimately undermines the credibility. So I want to give just a couple of examples of how it happens in practice and then spend most of the time on the solutions part of these issues. And the first example is just to illustrate the contingency of the choices that we make on the findings that we observe. So what I'm showing you here is a project that we did where we invited 29 independent teams to investigate the same research question. And the research question in this case was, are players with darker skin tone more likely to get red cards than players with lighter skin tone? And what you're seeing here in the circles are the estimated effect sizes that each of those 29 different teams generated for this question. The black line is a null effect, no relationship between skin tone of the player and likelihood of a red card. Effect size above the line are finding a positive association between darker skin tone and red card likelihood. And the 95% confidence interval is the box, the rectangle around the effect size. So in typical null hypothesis significance testing, if that box overlaps with the dark line, you would consider it a null effect. We don't have enough evidence to reject the null hypothesis. So what you can see here is about a third of the teams, those in gray, are the ones that found a null result, whereas those in green found a positive result. And there's a lot of variability across the teams. That happens a lot in research, right? There's different approaches to investigating a question, and so you get different findings, and then you would consider the meta-analysis of all of them to be the best estimate, given their different methodologies that they used. The twist in this study is that they all use the same data set. So not only did we give them the hypothesis to investigate, we gave them the data to use to investigate that hypothesis. And this is the variation in the outcomes that was observed. And we observed high variation outcomes because there's lots of reasonable choices to make in how one analyzes a complex data set. Different exclusion rules, different covariates, different modeling assumptions. All of those choices are things that a reasonable person has to make in order to decide how to analyze the data. But they're also consequential. And so the choices that are made make a difference for what result is observed. And the real challenge here is that when we read a normal paper, they report a single analysis strategy. And we read it as if those are the results that the data provided. But of course, that's not accurate. Those are the results the data provided contingent on all of the choices that were made along the way for how to analyze those data. And we don't easily recognize that contingency is consequential for the inferences that we draw. And so that flexibility that we have provides opportunity for potential things to become exaggerated over time. Okay, that's one example. A second example comes from the management literature, and there have been a couple of replications of this in other research areas. And what this team wanted to understand was what changes in what people report in their papers from what was done in the research to what the ultimate paper says was done in the research. And so what this group did was they made a creative solution of identifying 142 dissertations that they could find the dissertation and then that were ultimately published. And so they could find the publication. And so they compared them, what's in the dissertation of that research and then what's in the publication of the same study. And what they found was that 45% of the hypotheses in the dissertation were significant results, positive findings of the effect that they were investigating. Whereas in the papers of the same studies, 66% of the hypotheses were significant results. How did that happen? Well, things changed, right? So in some cases, tests were added or removed. So for example, 333 hypotheses were added to the publication that weren't in the dissertation. 70% of those were significant. Likewise, 1,333 hypotheses were removed before publication. Only 38% of those were significant. So there's a selection bias. Things that were more likely to be significant were more likely to get into the paper. Things that weren't were more likely to be removed. But then there were also the same tests in the dissertation and the publication. And what they found with these was that 272 hypotheses that were not supported in the dissertation, 20.6% of them became supported in the publication. The analysis strategy changed in some way that made them positive results, whereas the reverse was much less likely to happen. 373 supported hypotheses, only 4.6% of those became unsupported in the publication. So a lot changed between a dissertation and the publication, and a lot always changes because dissertations tend to have a lot more information than will fit into a normal publication. And perhaps the graduate student's approach to it was not the approach that the supervisor would have taken, the collaborative team, or what the editors and reviewers ask for in revisions. But wherever it is that those changes are happening, the point of this research is that those changes are consequential for the apparent credibility, the positivity of the findings that were observed. Things that weren't there were much less likely to not be there in terms of not even being reported, and much more likely to increase or potentially inflate the likelihood of seeing positive results. So that flexibility matters. Okay, so that's enough with more examples of the problems. I want to spend the rest of my time on how it is we're thinking about how do we actually address this? How can we improve openness, integrity, and reproducibility of research? And ultimately, we think that it's really two very simple things that need to change. They may be hard to change, but they're simple in concept. And they're the things that we learn in kindergarten, right? Show your work and share. If researchers show how it is they got to their claims so that the paper isn't just advertising, it is in fact a gateway to all of the evidence backing that, and if researchers actually share those protocols, materials, data, process information, then the self-corrective process that science promises to be can actually work. Researchers are great at criticizing each other. That's not a problem. The challenge is that they don't have the information to actually do effective criticism of the claims that are being made. And so it requires being able to see how it is that those claims were arrived at, and then be able to replicate, extend, challenge, use those materials in productive ways to improve the process, to accelerate the process of discovery. And so for us, this is really at the core of figuring out how is it that we can improve these two behaviors. And the way we've been thinking about the problem can be embodied with this pyramid as I show it here. Right? There are multiple things that are interdependent on each other in order to facilitate behavior change, particularly at this scale. At the base is infrastructure. We need tools that make it possible for people to do the new kinds of behaviors, make it possible for them to share data and materials, make it possible for them to register their research designs in advance. Ideally, those will be easy to use. So the interface and the experience, how it integrates with researchers' workflows that they have already, that they're already busy enough and they're already committed to, the better we can deliver on actually integrating with how researchers do their work, the more likely they are to adopt those behaviors, regardless of their rewards. Communities play a role in defining what the norms are. If no one else, I don't see anybody else in my field doing this behavior, why would I do it? It's not rewarded directly, other people aren't doing it. Even though I see it's a value, I also behaviorally see it's not being done. And so elevating communities to actually help to facilitate the norms of those values will accelerate their adoption. It may not be enough for people to see that others are doing it. You may need, for some, actual incentives, right? Yeah, it's good practice, but I'm just going to get my publications. Well, if those publications are actually linked to the behaviors that are the desirable behaviors, then they're even more likely to get adopted. And for the laggards that are just recalcitrants and want you to leave them alone, well, you have policy. You have to do it. This is how it is that research gets done. So all 5 of these are mutually reinforcing ways to shift and nudge some of these behaviors toward greater openness and reproducibility of work. And so I want to give just a couple of examples of some interventions at these levels, just to give you a sense of how it is we can think about current practice and just nudging it to move towards more improved practices. To call out the base very briefly, we operate what's called the OSF, at the Open Science Framework at the Center for Open Science. This is an open source collaboration tool that, like the electronic lab notebooks, gives researchers resources to be able to be more efficient in their collaborations, not lose their own data and materials for their own use, be able to pre-register their designs in advance, and to control access to these materials. So instead of being open being a whole extra thing that I needed to do later in the research process, being open can be something that's just a matter of intention. Do I want to make parts of our data open? Well, instead of now having to prepare it all, because our team has been using the OSF to archive our own work and it's all cloud-based, I just have to click the little Make Public button. And then I have to click the button that says, are you really sure you want to make this public? And I say, yep, I'm sure. And then that's open. So if we can integrate those private workflows that researchers need to manage effectively their research for their own use with public workflows of how they make that more accessible to others, then we can make it easy because we can actually solve problems researchers have and facilitate ways for them to adopt the new behaviors. So I'm happy to talk more about the OSF, but that's all I'm going to say about it, even though that's how we spend most of our time. Instead, I want to, with the time, talk about some of the incentive drivers that we might be able to shift those norms, incentives, and policies. And the first one is the super simple one, which is if people know that they're desirable behaviors, but they don't see that anybody else is doing it, well, then let's make that behavior visible so that I can see that other people are doing things like sharing their data or materials or pre-registering their research. And so we worked with a community of researchers to define specifications for badges for open data, open materials, and pre-registration that journals could adopt to say, if you as an author want to say, I'm sharing my data, I've put it in an independent repository, you'll get credit for it. This little badge will appear on your paper with a link to the data so that people can follow up with it. Now you might say, well, badges are stupid. We don't need no stinking badges. You know all the jokes about badges. But badge is not the point. The signal is the point. And we know, Psych 101, that signals really matter. We can signal a lot about our intentions, our values, our beliefs, just by how we dress, what we put on our car, very subtle things that we say. So those signals can indicate something about what's valued to me, what things am I doing, and can signal to the community of what others do, what's normative in this community, both from a prescriptive or a descriptive level of norms. So the question is, are badges sufficient to actually change the behavior? So let's study it. We had the journal Psychological Science was the first journal to adopt the badges. They adopted it January 1st, 2014. What I'm showing you here on the x-axis is time, the 2 years and 6 month intervals prior to adoption of badges at the bottom, first half of 2012 through the second half of 2013. And on the y-axis is the percent of articles in those journals that had open data. Psych Science had about 3% of the articles had open data, and the 4 comparison journals in the same field about the same. So Psychological Science adopts badges on January 1st, 2014, and then this is what happens. Right? By the first half of 2015, a year and a half later, 39% of articles in Psychological Science have open data. Right? That's 2015. If you look at this summer, 2018, the 3 issues that came out of Psychological Science, 90% of the articles have open data, right? For a stupid little badge, right? And the point, again, is not that the badge is actually anything meaningful other than as a signal of the behavior that is the desired behavior, that people already value, saying, yes, transparency on this process is good, it's just no one does it, no one seems to care about it. But now the journal signals, we care about it, we offer these badges for it. And then when people do it, others see, oh, other people are doing it. Maybe this is something that we do now. Okay, maybe I should do that. I want credit. And so it's easy to shift norms when the values are already there. It doesn't require a dramatic intervention. It just requires surfacing that those behaviors are actually occurring. Okay. A second example requires some prompting, which is related to some of the things that already came up. And that is that we have these 2 very important modes of research that happen every day. One is the context of justification, the other is the context of discovery. This is oversimplification, but for the purposes here, will be clear. Right? When we're in the context of justification, the reason to do a study is to acquire some data to confront a hypothesis that we have about the world. We have some model, some prediction about what we think is going to occur, and so we acquire data to test that, to confront it, to see if it survives that test, or whether we need to revise our understanding of the world. And so when we make choices in the context of justification, we're making the choices of how the data would inform on our expectations, independent of having observed the data. We don't know what the outcome's going to be. We have to set up our analysis plan, how we will evaluate our hypothesis, prior to knowing those outcomes. So this is the core of hypothesis testing. In the other mode, context of discovery, we're exploring. The reason to get data is to see what the data tell us about how the world might be. And so we look at the data, we are interacting with the data and generating new hypotheses about what the possibilities are. And so in that context, we are exploring this research. And until Aaron Roth finishes his work, we have these 2 modes. Maybe he'll make them all go away. But until then, this is really important to know that we are in these 2 modes, because the dominant way in which we draw statistical inference, null hypothesis significance testing, is meant for the one on the left, hypothesis testing. And in that context, p-values are interpretable because we know the universal of p-values. We made the plans in advance of how it is we were going to analyze those data. And as long as we report all of those analyses and we correct for the number of tests that we did, we can draw a diagnostic inference of those p-values. On the right, p-values lose their diagnosticity. Because of the interaction between the data and our choices, we no longer know all of the different decisions that we might have made, the garden of forking paths that, as Aaron mentioned. And because of that, we can't interpret the p-values confidently. But if we keep using the p-values, then we may be more likely to draw incorrect inference. And that's the real problem, because if we present exploratory evidence as if it's a confirmatory, then we increase the publishability. Look, we found something, but at the cost of the credibility of those claims. And so the key thing that we need to do is keep these two separate. And keeping those two separate is what pre-registration solves. Pre-registration does not privilege confirmatory research over exploratory research. Both of these are fundamental to research progress. What pre-registration does is help you know when you're in one or the other, so that you draw a strong diagnostic inference of your statistical tests when you're in confirmatory mode of analysis, and then you're free to do whatever you want with the data all the time when you're in exploratory analysis, and generate lots of ideas of what's possible to then inform what you do next in your research. What tests do you want to now confront now you think you've discovered something? And so adoption of pre-registration is one of the primary solutions for actually improving the credibility of our research claims. But it's also outside of the regular workflow of what most researchers that are doing preclinical or basic work do. It's not part of standard practice. So how can we build that in and encourage researchers to do that? Part of that is with things like badges. Oh, other people are pre-registering, maybe I should pre-register too. Part of it is training. How would you do it? Part of it is the infrastructure, the tools. OSF lets you pre-register. Okay, maybe I can do it. But there's also things that need to be incentives that go directly into the behaviors that researchers, the rewards that they need. And so one of those is the concept of registered reports. So you heard a little bit about this today. If you hadn't heard of it before, here's the very short version of what register report is. So this is the cartoon of how research happens, right? You design a study, you collect and analyze data, you write the report, and then you publish it. But of course, it isn't just like that. There's this big peer review blocker after you've written the report before it gets published. And in this context, the peer review is my antagonist. I know the paper deserves to be in that journal, and the peer reviewers, all they're going to do is tell me why it isn't good enough to be in that journal. So all of the incentives in this normal operating context are focused on me making that report as beautiful as possible so that the reviewers ultimately relent and say, fine, fine, publish it. Register reports makes one change, and it is to move the primary review from after the report is done to after the design is done. So with a registered report, when the journal offers this as an option, you submit the research question, justification for why it's important, why this needs to be studied, and the methodology you're going to use to study it, spelling it all out for how it is that this will advance our knowledge, whatever the outcomes are. The editor and the peer reviewers evaluate, is it an important question, and is the methodology a quality methodology to test that question? Do we need to know the answer? And if they agree that those things, this is important and the methodology is strong, then they provide in-principle acceptance to the article at that stage. What that means is, as long as you follow through with what you agreed to contractually with the editors of what the research will be, and you conduct it competently, they will publish it regardless of outcome. So this changes the incentives in a couple of key ways for authors and for reviewers. For authors, my goal is no longer to get the most beautiful, sexy results I can, because I don't know what the results are going to be. My incentives are ask the most important questions that I can and do the best methodologies that I can do to test them. For reviewers, the incentives are also different. When I'm asked to review something in my field, the first thing I do is check how many times I'm cited. Second thing that I do is look at whether the claims that are made are consistent with the claims that I've made or inconsistent. And if they're consistent with my claims, then this is a great paper. The methodology is perfect, publish it. If it's inconsistent, there are a lot of problems with that methodology that make this not worthy of publication. In the registered reports context, I have no idea what the results are. My incentives are make that methodology as good as it can be because I really believe in the phenomena that I've studied. And so I want it to be a good test of the questions that are relevant to me. Likewise, the relationship between me as a reviewer and the author have changed. Now, we are collaborators. In the old model, when I say what problems with methodology I found, all the authors can do is say, you're a jerk. I can't change the study now. It's all done. Critical feedback from a reviewer in this stage means that, okay, I'll change the design. It'll be a better study. So we have much less waste because the authors and the reviewers become much more collaborative in getting it to the best design it can be. It also, very subtly, builds in pre-registration. All of those commitments are made at the design stage, and then you follow through with what you said you were going to do, and then there's a separate section that is the exploratory analysis. And you design it in all the ways you want to design it in order to get the kinds of discoveries that you didn't anticipate up front. So now we have 141 journals that have adopted this as a publishing model, and so we're getting a lot of data that we could talk about how people are experiencing this in a variety of different practices. Okay, let me wrap up so we have a little bit of time for questions if there are any. Just want to show you that change is happening. So the big plot there is the number of registrations on the OSF from when we opened it in 2012 through 2017 last year has been doubling every year with people saying, pre-registration, that seems like something important to do, so I'm going to start doing it. And 2018 is doubling yet again. Up on the top left is the rate of adoption of registered reports journals that are offering this as a publishing model. So on any indicator that you look at for things showing adoption of open science practices and incentives, the growth rate is like this. So there is hunger in the community to live by the values that we've identified, that we just have not yet incentivized in our research. So I'll just close with the point that came up in the earlier session, which is that individual researcher's behavior isn't just based on the ideals that they hold internally, but also the incentives and norms that are communicated by the variety of stakeholders that influence them individually. The institution that they are in, the funders that grant their research, the journals that they publish in, and the societies that establish their norms. And the real challenge for culture change is that science is entirely decentralized. And so each person's idiosyncratic influences of incentives will shape his or her own behavior. And so if we're actually going to solve this in a real comprehensive way, we need to nudge those incentives together across these different stakeholder communities in order to advance an alignment between the values that we possess for science and the practices that we enable. So I will stop with that with links to more information for all of these, including a link to these slides. So if you take a picture, you can get the slides. Thanks very much for your time.
If anyone has a question, maybe one or two questions, please talk up. We don't have microphones in the audience, so if you want to speak up and ask Brian a question, go ahead.
I have two questions about the pre-registration. The first is, if you're moving most of the review to the study design phase, I'm assuming there is still some review that happens at the interpretation phase so that you're not having wild claims that are not supported by the data?
Yeah, excellent question. So in case you didn't hear it, although you spoke very loudly, that was excellent. The question was about registered reports and what happens at the initial review stage and what happens at the second stage. Yes, that second round of review, the reviewers look at the output. Did you follow through with what you said you were going to do? There might have been commitments at the outset for things you need to show that you did the study competently. Outcome independent indicators that if it was a neuroimaging study, you remember to turn on the magnet, whatever it is. So you have those things that they evaluate, and then they also evaluate interpretation. Are you being reasonable with what you found, or are you saying, oh, I didn't get the result, but actually I think everything I said at the beginning was still true, right? So you still have that evaluation. Likewise, at the first stage, the paper might be rejected because it seems too much of a long shot. And the reviewers will say, I think you need some more preliminary evidence, much like a grant review, before we're ready to commit to a critical study that we will then publish. So in fact, this is so similar to grant review that we have helped to facilitate some partnerships between funders and journals to have a single review process. And if it makes it through that review, the funder funds it, the journal commits to publish it. Nobody dislikes this because the author goes through one review process. Funders have a terrible time getting the research that they fund actually published, right? A huge portion of research never is seen by anyone. It's complete waste. And so getting commitments for publication dramatically enhance the return on investment. And then journals get good quality funded research from it. So that's more than you asked, but there's a full answer. Any
Other questions?
Just like a comment, that notebook that I spoke to you about before has a public data sharing feature.
Yes, so many of the notebooks that are available, OSF and otherwise, Lab Archive 2, have a public option. And so adopting some of these tools can facilitate greater transparency of the research process. And so there's a lot of good ones out there for communities to use. Yes, please.
Do you see any relationship with this model and the whole alt-metrics activity, and where this might fit in? I mean, so you're waiting for this end product, the publication output, but the component parts, along the way.
Yeah. Yeah, great question here. Is there any link to this with altmetrics? And if we're thinking, so yes, the key thing I think that greater transparency of the entire workflow and research products, what it offers is the opportunity to diversify the reward structure. So right now it's just the publication, where it is, and how many times it's cited. And the key incentive for me is to be an author on it, ideally first or last, right? If we start to reward research products, if they become citable objects of their own, then producing and sharing a good data set that other people cite and use, and it's cited in the reference list just like a paper is, then provides greater opportunity for me to have impact in different ways than just being a vertically integrated, come up with the idea, design the study, analyze the data, write the report, right? Likewise for code. Why can't code be a citable unit? And so there's a lot, the more that we can diversify research impact to the different forms of scholarly contribution, the more likely we can actually diversify what researchers do to try to advance science. They don't all have to do it the one way, which requires lots and lots of resources dedicated to very few researchers. Instead, if there's lots of ways to contribute, right? Good code, good data, good review, then researchers with a highly variable amounts of resources will be able to productively contribute and be rewarded for it. So thanks for the question.
Yeah, I just in terms of the whole cultural change with the triad repository, what we used to see is somebody goes in there, they put their data, and then they get the idea that there could be citation or tweeting about their data, because we would always, we did this whole running thing of the last 5 cool data sets that we contributed. And then we would call them our pet depositors, because the scientists would see, oh, somebody cited my data or somebody tweeted, and they would go to PubMed, they could like quickly, you could see, oh, they quickly uploaded 5 more data sets from
Yeah.
existing publications. So there's this evidence of cultural change right there with the like tweet.
Yeah.
Somebody's talking about their research.
Yeah.
They see the downloads. Like downloads don't necessarily mean reuse, but it's still
It's still an indicator. Yeah, the key here is that science is reputation-based economy ultimately, right? And so how is it that I can enhance my reputation? Whatever signals there are out there are signals that researchers will respond to. So thanks very much for the questions. Appreciate it.
Let's thank Brian.